Brian Flores' defense is taking the league by storm. Here's how he's doing it. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, where we're always trying to learn something new. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day each and every day. I appreciate you guys all so very much. So thank you for coming and hanging out. And if you are new here, or if you're maybe not even a Vikings fan, but you're just curious about Brian Flores, hello and welcome. You've come to the right place. You can find Locked On Vikings Monday through Friday every morning, anywhere you find your favorite shows. Just search it out. You can also find the show on YouTube or Amazon Fire and Roku if you download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So here's what we're going to do today. We're talking with Shawn Syed of Sumer Sports, Syed Schemes. You might have seen him on Twitter. He is an absolute football nerd, and I mean that in the best possible way. Love talking to Shawn. A lot of times when I'm confused about a play design, if I cannot identify what I'm looking at, I can DM him that clip and he'll help me. And this has happened a lot. So a lot of what has happened on Locked On Vikings, thank you to Shawn. So he's going to come on later on the show and we're going to talk a little Brian Flores. So I want to basically set up for that conversation. Brian Flores' defense is, I'm going to say, arguably like second best in the league. If you just want to look at EPA allowed per play, the Vikings rank second in that. They're tied for third in success rate. And so I this morning at Wide Left, an article that I wrote is releasing about if the Vikings are for real and sustainability metrics and like what it means to believe what we're seeing. Weird philosophy stuff because I get esoteric there, mostly to annoy Arif. But as part of it, I pulled a lot of these stats, basically trying to look for like, okay, where is the poison pill here? Where is the canary dying in the coal mine that tells us how this thing is going to collapse, right? And it ends up being a lot about like maybe it's turnovers. Here's what those look like. Are we scared of them and all that? Go read the article. But there are a lot more answers that are like, okay, it's not this, it's not this, it's not that. And defensively, rushing, EPA, they're tied for third. EPA per dropback, EPA allowed per dropback, tied for sixth. Their success rates are similar, and I like comparing EPA and success rate. If we're going to do the math thing, we're going to do the stats thing. I like comparing EPA and success rate because if one is super different from the other, like if your EPA is super low and your success rate is super high, kind of tells you that there's a few plays that are huge outliers that are dragging down your EPA, but they'll only go down as one failure on success rate, so they won't drag that down as much. And it can kind of help you understand what to look for. So if you're looking for like, wow, this is all super buoyed by outliers, compare those two, it'll probably give you your answer. But statistically, the Brian Flores defense is one of the only ones that has that passes this many of those statistical tests. Another way to look at it is like if you look at the Steelers, for example, they have a better coverage unit than the Vikings. But their rush defense is just straight up average. And so if you look at the total numbers, the Steelers defense is like a few ranks below the Vikings in like all the different categories. Because they don't have that same balance right now, at least through the first 4 games. So the defense is doing well. I probably didn't need to like give you a statistical case to tell you that. You all saw it. And the question is how. So if you are just looking for Brian Flores stuff, there's a lot in the library of Locked On Vikings that goes over this. We spent a long time in the offseason talking about that stuff schematically. We did a ton of it during the season last year. I have Patreon videos at patreon.com/LukeBrownNFL. So let me give you the crash course of that. And if you're more interested in things, you can go look up, more in-depth conversations from like May, right? But basically the philosophy is aggression. We know that about Flores, right? He likes to blitz. How do you get away with blitzing though? in an ideal world, you have 3 or 4 players who can just man up against anybody, or just great corners, Sauce Gardner's. By the way, Vikings playing him in London. That can just man up a guy and survive. And you can just do that, win all your one-on-ones, and everybody else rushes the quarterback, you get 1 million sacks. Great way to live if you have the dudes. Very few teams have the dudes. There are very few dudes like that in the league. I would say you could probably count them all on one hand. So what most teams do when they do a pressure like that is they'll send some number of players. They'll go into some kind of cover one, which is man coverage with like a rat, right, with a middle of field guy. Or they'll sacrifice the rat and just go man coverage with one deep guy over the top to make sure that if you do get beat, it's not for a touchdown. And then a lot of those players will either be man coverers or green doggers. Green dog means you just wait. If the guy you're supposed to be man covering is blocking, then you pass rush and you add yourself into the situation. What Flores does is not so worried about the numbers game. He'll leave 6 in coverage if he's sending 5. And what a lot of zone teams will do is they'll have 3 deep zones, 3 shallow zones. Flores is doing a little bit of different stuff. We'll get into more of that with Shawn, but a little more quarters. But the pressures themselves, the way that they're designed, the systems that they use, like I think a lot of DCs will just like design cool blitzes. And those are things that you can probably pull out 2 or 3 times before there's too much tape on them for them to work anymore. The way that Flores's works to keep it sustainable, to support the high volume of blitzes, that's like kind of unique. Like you don't need to run a pressure 2 or 3 times because you're not going to blitz every down unless you're Flores. For Flores, it uses a lot of twists and stunts, systems of, tackle end exchanges in the middle, 3-man stunts where you have 2 crashers and 1 guy looping around both of them, and mixing and matching and combining those with insert pass rushers from depth, from off-ball linebackers or even corners coming off the edge. And it creates this really difficult scenario for like any center to sort out. And understanding that the second you threaten somebody to blitz, pass protection systems must account for that guy. So simming that guy out isn't tricking them, it's forcing their hand. There's no world where a center says, gosh, if only I knew that guy wasn't blitzing. You're not, the system doesn't allow for you to even ask that question. If he's on the line of scrimmage, we are accounting for him in the protection. And if he falls off, then whoever was supposed to be blocking him, has their instruction to go look for work or do something, find a way to be productive. And hopefully you get every threat accounted for that way. But that's really difficult to sort all that stuff out, to do it all without messing up, to keep everybody on the same level, to keep everybody looking, downfield, to keep anybody from overcommitting to one crasher or one person. You lose a lot of reps that, hey, the line could have picked this up if they played perfect, but how often do you play perfect? It's what a lot of defense is forcing, if the offense plays everything perfect, they get a touchdown, you just take that. And you're going to win games going, well, they couldn't be perfect, but for a couple of reps, and they were actually imperfect. And whatever mistake they do make, are we in a position to punish it, to make it work, to make it count, to make it, worth something? So supporting that aggression with the right coverages and supporting that aggression with a mix and match style of blitzing that allows you to keep things variable enough so it doesn't get predictable, but not have to install 10,000 different pressures everybody has to memorize. You can just say, okay, we're going to do this stunt and that stunt, and the mic's going to come. Okay, that's just what it's going to be. And everybody doesn't need to know that one's actually called Yarmady. I don't know what pressure names they do. But that's the key. You're blitzing at volume. The aggression and the philosophy is there, but because you're blitzing at volume, you have to cover in a certain way to survive. You can't live in cover 1 all day unless you've got a team of Sauce Gardners. And you can't custom make every single pressure and force your team to have it installed because there's just too much volume for that. You need a system that keeps it sustainable, that can generate them. So how all that happens, more specifics about how all that happens, comes up next with Shawn Syed. Today's episode of Locked On Vikings is brought to you by PrizePicks. It's the best way to play daily fantasy football. on this here planet Earth. And right now you can win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. PrizePicks is the way that I've been playing because I live in California, so that's the best way to do it there. That's been my favorite way to get a little extra intrigue on a game that I otherwise wouldn't care about. Like, Dolphins, Titans, I don't care, but if I need Will Levis to get an interception so I can win that box, then I care. And the amounts at PrizePicks that they give you are very often weird. And if you can identify the weird ones, you can add them to your play. Pick 2 to 6 of your favorites, the ones you're most confident in, and if they're all right, you win a bunch of money. So sign up today and you can get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to get that $50 bonus. It is guaranteed. Just play anything for $5, you get $50 instantly. PrizePicks, run your game. All right, everybody, here with Shawn Syed of Sumer Sports. Thank you so much for coming back on the show, Shawn. Very frequent question answerer from this guy, let me tell you.
Luke, I really appreciate it. I feel like the last time we really got to talk into a microphone together, I mean, those are the Ed Donatel days. Times are different.
It was a while ago. Yeah. Well, we were just getting to know, this is a McVay scheme. This is different. What's different between like Kubiak stuff we've been running. But we're talking about the other side of the ball now. And no, it is not Vic Fangio style. It sure is aggressive. So what we're going to do today is I want a Brian Flores like crash course. Where we can kind of understand the mechanisms and sort of the pressure points that are determining all of the success that he's having right now, but like kind of decide whether you win or lose. Like, what does this stuff come down to? But to get into any of that, we first need to understand the basic philosophy of a Flores defense, which is blitz a lot and get away with it. So how do they do that?
So to me, even further than just blitz away and get away with it, Flores does such a good job of forcing the offense to play on his terms. And so many teams across this league, KOC does a really good job.
You must bubble screen 20 times today. Yeah,
that's forcing it to just into kind of predictable answers. I think he does a really, really good job understanding first and foremost, what is the offense's most common pass protection? How can we find a way to isolate your tight end, your running back on one of our blitzers? And then how can we force you into some of those shorter throws? Well, we're still going to have a coverage guy right there because across the league, you're going to see 5-man blitzes from every single team, right? That's kind of a basic thing that happens. Most of the time, you're going to see 3 deep defenders, 3 underneath defenders. But what Flores is doing more of this year is you're keeping some of those, super scary 2 high safety shells where we can play a little bit more flexible on the back end. And if, the usual answer is sometimes you're throwing that quick flat route, hey, now we have a cornerback right there. So I think he's done a really good job combining that sort of philosophy with now, Luke, the personnel is just better. I think when I start to think about how it looked last year, it was maybe more fun than good at times, but now it is fun and good.
Yeah. It's a lot of experience, and the concern going in with guys like Gilmore and Shaq Griffin was like, well, what are we going to get from these guys at this point in their careers? These guys both felt like their best years were behind them. But I think the impact of experience, at least that's, I think, what I super underestimated was the impact of like everybody is Harrison Smith is a veteran. Cam Bynum's been around the block now. He's at the end of his rookie contract, and he's like one of the young ones. But even the backup linebacker, Kamu Grugier-Hill, he's in year 7. So these guys have seen a little bit, and the idea of asking them, okay, just go play palms is like something you could just say to Stephon Gilmore and not have to install. You can just tell him go play palms. He knows what that means and how to do that well.
I think that it's a good example of a coach also making life easier on his cornerbacks a little bit, because if I think about kind of isolation, like where do I want to attack?
They like never man up.
Yeah. And I think that's a really smart idea because you can create pressure and you can still force tight window throws without playing man coverage. And, a lot of times that's going to be Gilmore coming up, get into press coverage. And now he's just playing that kind of flat area of the field instead of having to drop back so many times. So it's you have that, and then they do mix it up so much. Like Luke, obviously we have to talk about, how many times am I going to watch a safety go from one side of the field to the other side of the field? I don't know. And, at the end of the day, if you just chart, well, this is what the coverage is like, okay, yeah, it's cover 2, but they're getting to cover 2 and 2-man. Like there was a great example against the Packers where they're playing 2-man where they have like 8 guys up on the line. It's a clear cover 0 look. And I'm like, I mean, people in Madden don't even do that. I'm not even sure if you're allowed to do that in Madden just based on how the playbooks are. And for Flores to do that and force quarterbacks to work really hard after the snap, and even if you're working hard after the snap, you're probably not going to get it right. And also Jonathan Grenard is coming right down at you. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's the best scheme in football. Is it the best individual defensive players in football? Probably not, but I still think it's so good and has the right pieces. Like, I'm not sure if you take all of these guys in isolation out to other places. I don't know. I'm just not sure how Josh Metellus looks, but he looks so good in this system. And that's all that matters, that Flores is able to get the most out of them.
Yeah, if he just goes and plays like regular old nickel corner or like regular old, strong safety, like he probably is just a dude. But in this particular role, they've found this like versatility thing, and he is genuinely playing like one of the best defenders on this team. Like if you told me one of these guys was making $20 million, and like 44 wouldn't be a bad guess. But what I think is interesting in all of the disguises, because like a big part of making them play on your terms is showing the quarterback a look that makes him check into something. Because everybody's got checks now. Everybody's got can. Everybody calls 2 plays at the line. So let's show you a big blitz look and make you go into your conservative horse crap. And then we'll back it off into a Tampa 2 zone. And now you just threw a bubble screen or a tunnel screen into Tampa 2 zone where there's a guy sitting right there where the thing's supposed to be. And all he's got to do is, stay a little bit inside so the line doesn't get him. Like, that's setting up your players to make relatively easy plays, and then they can just go be playmakers. But I love the Tampa 2 stuff that they're doing, especially on the sim pressures. Line 7 guys up, only rush 4, back everybody off. You've got corners playing off coverage. They turn into the half defenders and everybody else backs off into underneath zones. And it's like everybody's job looks super doable. Nobody's being asked to do anything impossible, and then they can go be playmakers. And yet to the quarterback, it is a hurricane of what in God's name am I looking at?
And you have to, at some point, like bring pressure to really make a quarterback feel threatened by the appearance of pressure. And obviously Flores does that. So I'm glad that he has both, where you see teams across the league where, they're going to line up a bunch of guys up front, but they're not really going to bring a lot of pressure. So the offensive line can kind of sort things out. And Flores does a really good job of, even when he's only sending 4, he's going to create a one-on-one somewhere. So sometimes that's, Van Ginkel just in whatever spot for that play he has, where this guy's just moving across the entire
an edge on a guard
formation.
Is one he's been liking. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's something that is really, really worth it to have as a defensive coordinator that I think you do see it more obviously as like the Mike McDonald kind of scheme just pushes through the league, where it's like, look, if we have to game the pass rush a little bit, let's just get a linebacker full speed on a running back, because now we're keeping you in coverage. Now we can play with even, better looks on the back end. But I'm just so impressed with like how the linebackers are playing is so fun, because they don't have an easy job. Like Cashman doesn't have an easy job. Obviously, you hope that Pace is back this week. It is not an easy job to drop into space where offenses know that they can probably target you. And like the middle of the field is the most valuable part of the field in so many ways. Everyone's drawing up places to attack. Every time I see a linebacker drop right into a route, I'm like, okay, that is just fantastic teaching and fantastic execution. So you have a coach that is just getting the absolute most out of every single player. So it's just hard not to love that. And then where I think last year, there was a little bit of conversation of like, how sustainable is it? Can you survive with that?
It was gimmicky.
It certainly was. But now they can play you straight up. Like you said, that 4-man rush, kind of Tampa 2 behind it. Like that, not that that's like a base look for every single team, but that's also not a 7-man rush. So if I'm an offense and I'm saying, man, I don't know where these guys are going to come from. I don't think all of them are going to be pressuring every single time. We have to sift this out in so many different ways. I need to do so much work at the line of scrimmage, where offenses are optimized in a few different ways now. So the quarterback doesn't have to do as much work at the line. So just a really, really good situation that I do think it is sustainable, particularly because it's just a little bit different than what we saw last year.
Right. And one of the big differences, and we'll get into kind of how they fix some of the problems a little later, but one of the big differences has been their increased use of quarters. This is something that was not as common last year. When they wanted to zone off, they either did 3 deep, 3 under. They sometimes did 3 deep and 2 under if they wanted to send 6, but they still wanted to kind of close down the middle of the field. And if they were going to do split safeties, it was probably a 7-man coverage, if I recall the way they did it last year. But this year they're doing 6-man quarters. 6-man cover for, whether they're having those corners do like palms or whatever. They're having the linebackers play a little bit more of an inside zone. They're playing hook to curl instead of like out in the flats where you sometimes would. If you felt like you had two underneath defenders, you feel like they would split the field in half, but they're not. They're letting the flats be a little more open, and we're having the corners play that a little more aggressively a lot of the times. And then sometimes they don't do that. They have the corners play straight up so that it doesn't become exploitable. But I don't know, like in terms of quarters behind a 5-man blitz, do you feel like that's just an insane thing to do, or do you feel like this is the new innovation that's going to take the league?
I think there are a lot of defensive coordinators that would look at that and be like, oh, we're not allowed to do that, because so many defensive coordinators don't do that. But certainly this year on film, you see it a lot more. Now, this is, of course, something that, Spags in Kansas City has used a lot of, but I'm so glad that Minnesota is using it. You think about it. All right, we're sending 5 rushers.
2-4-0 teams, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think deserve a lot of credit, and I think maybe are getting a closer look. But hey, you keep winning games, and we don't get to decide who the Vikings play, right? So if you're running that type of coverage,
they played good teams.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm really circling that Lions game. I think for a lot of reasons. I think a lot of people
that one's going to be big.
That's going to be a fun one, I think, because you are going to be able to see. Like Ben Johnson's going to run the ball until they kick him out of Detroit, which I don't think that will anytime soon. I think he's going to leave on his own accord if he does. So that is something where, even in that Texans game, I was kind of curious because Houston had a good running game in their first game against Indianapolis. And I was like, it's Minnesota. How are they going to deal with the run? Man, they just shut it down. Like if they can continue to do that, like what's going to stop this team? Where you mentioned that kind of 5-man rush, playing with those 2 high safeties. Now you're playing like 3 defenders to a side over 2 receivers to one side and doing the same thing to the other. Because the offense has to keep a running back in. They're going to be too afraid. If they send the running back out, we're getting a free rusher. And, you can make some of those throws to wide open running backs kind of in the flat. They'll have, a cornerback come up and tackle that. But you just can't leave your quarterback kind of like uncovered for that long.
Well, that's the devil's bargain that a lot of these teams made late last year, and it was working. So next I want to kind of talk about how that problem got papered over. So we will be right back with Shawn. Back with Shawn in a second, but today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. The NFL is in full swing, and that means that FanDuel is also in full swing. The Vikings finally favored in a game. They're minus 2.5 in London, and what is important about that, and the reason that it's minus 120, which means the market's hammering it, and the reason the market's probably hammering it is that hook point, which means the difference between, minus 3, a full field goal, and minus 2.5. So if they win by a field goal, you get it. That extra little half point is really huge because, 3 is a really common margin of victory for NFL games. If it was 3 and even or 3.5, it would be a lot less popular. So if you want to check that out, or if you want to go bet on whatever is going on with the Minnesota Vikings or anywhere else in the wide world of sports, you can, of course, find it all at FanDuel. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, by the way, you can check FanDuel. You can bet live on these things. So if the Vikings are, say, up 28-7 at halftime, but you feel that collapse coming, maybe you can go check that out as well. Get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed whenever you place your first $5 bet. So go to FanDuel.com, sign up, place a $5 bet on whatever it is, and whether or not you win, you will get $200 in bonus bets so you can get going playing around on FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. Keeping it rolling here with Shawn, Syed of Sumer Sports. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk flow with me. This is always a fun thing to talk about when it's going well, but it wasn't always going well. So late last year, December, the Vikings had a shutout of the Las Vegas Raiders on December 3rd. They did not win another game. And the next game they played was against the Bengals. The Bengals pulled out some tricks that led to a 3-score collapse, the biggest collapse the Vikings have ever given up, by the way, which I started Googling after the Packers game almost got out of hand. The biggest collapse the Vikings had ever given up was that Bengals game. They would end up losing it in overtime 27-24, and then Matt LaFleur and Ben Johnson twice were their last 3 games. Those guys took out the same concepts, absolutely dunked on the Vikings defense. They couldn't buy a stop. The Vikings lost 4 straight to end the season, missed the playoffs. So that was an issue. Brian Flores had the whole offseason to go in the lab and figure out what he was going to do about it. So first off, How familiar are you with like what the issue was in the first place?
To me, it felt like the issue was, eventually you can't hide all of your coverage players. Like it's just going to happen that the offensive line is
It
able
was
to
Harrison Phillips in
cover it.
coverage a little often for my taste.
Yeah, and I think that the initial thought when you see this defense is, all right, we need to get the ball out quick. But kind of against that, I actually think the offenses that did the best job is wad up the protection, hold on the ball a little bit, and take a vertical shot. We certainly saw it in in their Packers game last season. We saw it like for maybe like 2 reps in the Packers game against the Vikings this past week, where you're able to make intermediate throws because they're going to be playing kind of spot zone coverage where you're dropping to an area a little bit more. Of course, they're going to match just a little bit based on what the offense is doing, but you could find ways to have those intermediate inbreakers over and over last year. And it feels like part of their answer this year is, okay, we're not going to send the same amount of pressure, or we're going to send pressure in a little bit different ways. We can play a little bit more sound in coverage, but part of that is you're able to do that because you have like a guy like Andrew Van Ginkel who can play so many different spots. You have Jonathan Grenard, who you can feel comfortable with him rushing one-on-one. And of course, you could feel comfortable with Daniel Hunter doing that last year, but it just feels like taking the movement overall from we are going to be crazy to like kind of more controlled chaos where we're still going to send a lot of pressure. We're still going to send these funky looks, but we should feel more comfortable on the back end dealing with some of those inbreakers.
Yeah, and part of it too is I think they've changed the way that like they're not putting too many players in coverage that they want to hide. I don't think I've seen a single rep of a D tackle getting put back in coverage, which for like 6 years that was Flores's kind of Achilles heel. Was you could, like, the rules were wherever the center slides, that A gap defender would drop, and that would be a nose tackle sometimes. And you could get Harrison Phillips or whoever, I forget who it was in Miami, but like you could get that guy into coverage and possibly exploit it by, that guy would have a flat responsibility, and then suddenly Joe Mixon on a swing pass is going explosive. But now part of it is, I think, because they have true 3-4 outside linebackers. Van Ginkel can play coverage. Grenard can play coverage. Those guys are different than Daniil Hunter, who very much you wouldn't want that guy in coverage. Also, because he's just such a crazy pass rushing threat. You don't want to give a tackle a break. But with Grenard and Van Ginkel, those guys in coverage, like what Van Ginkel, he can drop to a spot very well and like close down a slant. Like there are some good zone drops off of Van Ginkel in on some of this tape. So you don't have players in coverage that are like, oh, that's the matchup, right? I mean, they can still, if you want, you can still get a slot receiver on Van Ginkel, probably be okay with that matchup. But it's a lot different than I got, T. Higgins on Harrison Phillips. That's a different thing.
Yeah, it feels like there are maybe just less of those kind of read pressures where like, hey, we're going to send 5 people total. It looks like we're going to send 7, whichever way the guard and the center are kind of moving. We're going to pop those 2 guys out.
It's just that the rules are different. That like it's either Van Ginkel or Grenard dropping instead of it's either Metellus or Jonathan Bullard.
And I think that's a combination of Quezado Fomensa, never miss a chance to kind of praise him. I think you bring in the right players there, but also Flores doing like a hard look in the mirror for his self-scout for this team and saying, hey, if we're not good enough in this spot, we're not going to be able to run some of these things. Where again, last year it did feel like throwing things at the wall. And I mean, certainly shout out to KOC just bringing in Flores there, where you're going to totally change up your style overall. So I think that you're totally hitting the exact right point where your scheme is going to look better when your players are better, but also when you have like these roles are tailor made for these guys. It is so fun watching it, where obviously I know Vikings fans have a long history of Harrison Smith running across the entire field. He can still do that. Like he can still do that this deep into his career. So when you have guys that have played like the Van Ginkel, literally you saw him in Miami do that same thing over and over. And now he's having these pick sixes and able to really create issues and get his ball or get his hands on some of those throws. It's just, I don't know what to do from an offensive standpoint. I'm thinking that, are you going to have a team that's going to be able to just run the ball over them? I do want to see, can someone just block with 7 and just send your guys deep? Because I think that that's really the right approach, where maybe you can throw the ball straight over them, but I mean, it's to be seen. We're going to have to see someone do that.
Packers did a little bit of that down the stretch during their like little comeback effort. The Packers had like 3 verts concepts and 7 in protection. There was still pressure, so they didn't get it. And then Jordan Love would have to kind of throw one on the run, which he can do. So it was very late in the down. He would heave like a floater and, eventually, like they came down with a couple of them, and then eventually a Viking came down with one of them, and that sort of put a damper on things. But you did see a little bit of that. So I think if you had but you need a lot of things, right? You need those vertical threats. You need a quarterback that can escape pressure, extend the down, and then find that vertical sometimes across the field. You need somebody that's like kind of that crazy. Perhaps by the time the Vikings see the Bears later in the season, that guy will be Caleb Williams. That will be an interesting thing to see, but I also don't really think the Bears schematically have the sauce to figure that out. They're still just trying to get ahead of the chains on first down, but like that'll be an interesting test. Ben Johnson could be an interesting test. Like they've got the villains in the division here that can answer those questions, but is it the same thing? Is it, hey, let's just block 8 and throw it vertical like Jordan Love did, on New Year's last year? But where can you get, like, what's your staple against? I mean, that's a shot play, right? Like, what's your bread and butter if you're coming into a Flores matchup?
I mean, obviously, hope you don't get that matchup. Like, I feel like that's the bread and butter. Like, can we change the schedule? Let's get out of this division in some sort of way.
Some of them get it twice. What do you do?
Another game I'm actually really excited for is the Seahawks game. I think it's like a right around Christmas time, late in the season against the Vikings, because that's an offense where, I mean, Geno Smith really knows how to handle pressure, and he's going to constantly take shots. I do think like Flores' defense just increases the variance of a game. You can all of a sudden throw 2 interceptions, miss 2 field goals, and just like have the game be over like right away.
Right.
But you can also,
suddenly you're down 24-0. You're like, what happened? Yeah.
Yeah. And you can also, I mean, like throw some touchdowns on some of those looks. So I want to see teams continue to do that. It's hard because like Jordan Love does that and he threw some wild balls, but I think you have to do that against the Vikings. You have to be comfortable that there's going to be those situations. You cannot play this game against the Vikings safe. Like the ball's going to be in harm's way a few times. They're going to get you sometimes, but you're hoping that, maybe you can stop the unstoppable force of Sam Darnold and Kevin O'Connell together on the opposite side, where you're not just playing from down all the time. I didn't like the Packers, they had like a few nice early runs. I keep thinking about, is a team going to be able to kind of control things that way? But I think Flores is just fine if you're going to, pick up 6 yards a few times. Eventually, you're going to get a shed from one of these D linemen where Harrison Phillips now is a tackle for a loss, and all of a sudden you're behind the stick. So I do want to see a team just devote themselves to playing hero ball for an entire game and just see what happens. Because, the other things aren't working yet. Even like CJ Stroud had some absolute sick throws against the Vikings, and that game wasn't even close to being close. So
by the time he had them, like things had already gone so awry that it was over, which is how all of these games have gone. And a lot of that has to do with the offense as well, which we didn't have time to get to today. But Shawn, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been awesome.
Thanks so much, Luke. Always appreciate it. Go Vikings.
Always a pleasure, Shawn. Thank you so much. Tomorrow's Crossover Thursday, we'll be talking to John Butchko of Locked On Jets in preparation for this London Vikings-Jets game. We'll be full on Jets mode. I will see you all for that. And as always, Skull.